Conclusion. When attempting a conclusion, it might be possible to summarize in the form of a dogmatic synthesis what has only been brought out by the research of a multiple analysis of the texts. This effort to take stock of the investigation that we have conducted, it will not have the sole meaning of a summary, since the circle in which we were taken at the start has committed us to being able to legitimize the origin of our reflection only by the success of its arrival. This clarification must therefore have the value of justification, of apology. Thereby, its coherence calls into question the whole of our argument. The phenomenology of spirit is neither a preface nor a part of the Hegelian system. It is the search for what makes possible the totality of a system of thought that wants to present itself as science. It is the approach that will allow a thought to be systematic without contradiction. This foundation of systematic knowledge in the phenomenology of spirit discovers in it an absolute knowledge, which is not fullness of content, but an indeterminate conceptual environment, adequate to a consciousness, the self, whose entire activity is expressed in an I know. This consciousness, elementary environment, we have called it transcendental subject. This consciousness, which is knowledge, is at the same time knowledge of oneself in its empirical development and constitution of this development in its true meaning. Thus, knowledge of oneself and constitution of oneself, such are the two characteristics of absolute knowledge, of which one generally recognizes only the first side. Absolute knowledge constitutes itself from the elementary to the totality, first part of the phenomenology of spirit, from the immediate totality to the fully realized totality, second part. Specifically, the second movement is that of history. The first impulse is ahistorical. History is therefore a moment of the transcendental subject in its activity of constitution. It is neither the first nor the last of these moments, but is perhaps the principal one. It covers the totality of experience that absolute knowledge will know as totality. The movement of mediation which carries empirical consciousness to its transcendental knowledge. It is the history in which and by which is aroused the consciousness which knows itself in the totality of its empirical becoming. This we of the philosopher which is adequate to the transcendental subject. So many theses which could not have expressed for Hegel the truth of his system. So many reflections caught in the strange contradictions of wanting to think Hegel's phenomenology in contempt of what he himself thought of it. It is true that the meaning of Hegelianism is to be sought in a universe which is not Hegelian, and it is not within the system that reflection can grasp its truth. Then Hegel, he was of all the most ignorant of his own thought, the happiness having found in the calm of absolute knowledge his reconciliation with the world, turns for him into the worst of misfortunes, because he did not know its true meaning. His destiny was to be separated from his own thought, and to know it only as a stranger, at the very moment when he intended to establish the equality of a certainty with the truth of the world. Immediate certainty, it falls outside the truth. It painfully encounters its alienation and does not recognize itself in it. After all the obscure tricks of reason, which Hegel, one by one, has dissipated, it is necessary, against Hegel, to denounce as a supreme illusion this ignorance of absolute knowledge which knows the truth of all things except its own. Hegel would be the last of the unhappy consciences, the one in which all the others are summed up and denied. The preceding analyses do not, however, seek to stretch Hegelianism into such a contradiction. It is not on a level with a system that it has to be decided to place them. It is rather at the more universal level where the system attempts to find its foundation, and outside itself justifies the whole of its content. What then, at the end of our historical investigation, are these new types of reflection? Is this still ignored sphere where all systematic thought must justify its starting point? The historical constellation of 1806 gives us immediate meaning to the attempt of the phenomenology. From Kant, and especially from Fichte, Hegel had inherited the legal concern to find for every possible system of thought a legitimate foundation. But it was necessary to avoid this preliminary care, absorbing all the virtual forces of the system in the abstract search for a legal status, and it was necessary not to let the content of being be exhausted in the preliminary quest for the right to existence. However, in the sphere of his thought, in his own universe of work, Hegel saw the need for a similar approach emerging. The philosophy of Jena, in one leap, it had jumped into this absolute where any system can be deployed. It expressed the enthusiasm of a thought that had not yet reflected on its right to be enthusiastic. Deprived of all jurisdiction, the gratuitousness of the starting point referred only to the contingency of its fact. The work of Phenomenology in 1806 is a recasting, a questioning of the very foundations of the edifice. Its meaning is legal, its purpose is legitimation. Deployed in this crisis of a foundation, where Kant and perhaps Fichte had exhausted the possibilities of their system, the phenomenology of spirit, it is the bracketing of the real philosophy. It is repentance. It attempts to make that which has been done that which has not been done. This is doubtless the meaning of the preface added to the phenomenology when the meaning of the work had become clear to the author. Hegel not only attacks Fichte and Schelling, the philosophies of abstraction and those of enthusiasm, but also he fights with them, with the philosopher he would have been, that he already was in his dogmatic lectures at Jena, if he had not taken the trouble to write the phenomenology. It is the entire first system that is dispersed there and falls to dust, a calm echo of the contemporary upheaval in German history. By this return to the sources of a systematic thought, Hegel prepared for himself the most contradictory of destinies. The phenomenology, for a moment, put the Hegelian universe in parentheses, but this universe returned the favor. In this latter system, the meaning of the work, it did not find its exhaustive realization. It ceased to appear as the primordial justification of the entire system. Rather, it was a moment in the systematic development of the encyclopedia. But the opposite would have been paradoxical, since his aim was to seek outside the system that which could give justification and right of citizenship to the whole of a system. Necessary for the existence of a thought that totalized itself, its meaning could only remain foreign to it. The level reached here is that where thought transcends itself in order to be able, in its successive moments, to deploy the immanence of the world. The problem is therefore displaced. It's not a surpassing and a justification of thought in a world external to the same thought, but the fact of transcendence has become an act of thought. It has, without paradox, become immanent to it, but it is no longer to be sought at the end of the system as its proof. Rather, it is to be sought at its origin as the affirmation of its right. It is in this search for the foundation, in this process of transcendence, immanence to thought, that we will see that the philosophical act par excellence and what founds this act is a general axiomatic of thought. If it is true that the reflective activity of the philosopher consists in this position of a transcendence which seizes experience at its root and seizes things from behind, then metaphysics can be designated at the pure point of their origin in a very anti-Brunschvigian expression as a movement of descent on the spot. But what does this approach consist of? What is the universe that it discovers when its odyssey finally comes to an end? What the axiomatics of thought strives for is this sphere of legal universality, where the totality of experience takes on the legitimate meaning of totality, where the diaspora of the multiple, of tearing, and of misfortune is grasped together in the unity of its principle, where the tiny worlds of a plural experience beyond their being discover their reason for being in the singularity of a unique universe. From the heights, places of pain where lost consciousness is reconciled with itself, its long procession only stops at the moment when this total field of experiences unfolds before it, which is the philosopher's promised land. This original one, this one from before creation, is not the stripped and naked one of an atom without interiority, nor is it the monarchical and totalitarian one of a principle without exteriority, but rather the one whose position is the first axiom of philosophical thought and has the ambiguity of being at once element and principle. Principle of constitution, law of this constitution. It is at the same time the one and the first, perpetual and incessant reversibility from the cardinal to the ordinal. It envelops in this obscure dualism the discontinuity of measures with the hierarchical continuum of values. It is in this ambiguity that resides, still hidden, the dyad, and with it the endless theory of experiences. But above all, this one, it is not the unity of existences. It does not run beneath beings, binding them in secret with a bond of conceptual unity, nor does it illuminate them by conferring on them with life the light of life. The one towards which thought transcends itself is immanent to the same thought, the unity of its knowledge, and the totality of its experiences, to become the experience of a being a totality, of their right also to be this totality. The one is knowledge, in Hegelian terms, absolute knowledge. The philosophical act of transcendence is therefore not the effort of an interiority towards an exteriority which justifies it, almost forgives it for being an exteriority, not the expression of a speculative bad conscience which seeks elsewhere than in itself the right to be itself, but rather it affirms the philosophical euphoria of a thought which knows itself capable of justifying itself. This, surpassing in eminence, is the mediation of one knowledge to another knowledge, of a knowledge in experience to a knowledge of experience. Knowledge of experience that is absolute knowledge. It is not a content deployed in its disjointed moments, not the geographical outline of a totally explored universe, but it is only the open possibility of contents and power. And if it is absolute, it is because far from being at the extreme of determination, the ignorance of all relativity, it rather envelops and profile all relations. With it is constituted and realized a mode of reflection which is total reflection, reflection authorized to reflect everything. With it is defined a region of all other regions, the horizon of all horizons, the global profile where each of these profiles of knowledge is outlined. And thus is presented a universe not yet developed, a universe without thematic explanation, a universe where a total theory of experience plays still in the shadows. At this level, each explanation will constitute a moment of this integral systematics. The subject of this knowledge, this same subject who, in the irreplaceable instant of his empirical history, has resolved themselves to the act of philosophical transcendence. Therefore, this subject who knows their experience as a totality, they have become the subject of this absolute knowledge. They have revealed themselves to themselves as a philosophical subject, or rather as a subject of philosophy. It is through them that the experience has come to knowledge in its totality. This totality reveals them as a transcendental subject. Together, they were born from the world of empiricism. From their reciprocity was born this new region of experience, which is the philosophical sphere. Let it suffice to indicate in what sense the content of this sphere was to be developed. In it, the consciousness of the meditating philosopher thinks of themselves as a transcendental subject, thereby recognizes themselves as the subject of all possible experience. They express themselves in their constitutive activity, which rouses all the regions of experience and consciousness. That is to say, the philosopher who knows themselves to be at the origin of all these regions can grasp the principle which makes those principles come into being, the way in which they successfully engender themselves in their objectivity. The philosopher knows their order, at the same time understands the phenomenon of their order, that is to say, time. The philosophers know with their genesis of which they are the author, the mode according to which this genesis appears to the naive consciousness. That is why all philosophy will be a science of history and of the reverse of history. It will be the science of history which constitutes the activity of the subject and the genesis of the regions of experience. That is why the phenomenologist, still caught in the dispersion of experiences, in the hierarchy of their levels, brings out what founds each of these experiences. But the imminence of the research must soon take off from itself and split itself, courageously abandon the immediacy of experiences in order to take the philosophical step towards their totality. Then will be revealed as the totality of all regions, the integral region where we see the geneses and constitutions developing, as and revealed as a philosophy that opens up in the science of the totality of experience and the successive genesis of its different regions. The lesson we have learned from the phenomenology of spirit, it is therefore that philosophy itself must retain its autonomy, despite all possible phenomenologies. That the passage from one to the other is imposed, on the contrary, in a perspective that aims to be exhaustive. That this passage, however decisive it may appear, is nonetheless necessary. It is in this necessity of the passage that lies the essential difference between Husserl and Hegel, where the Idean seek to dissipate the sphere of philosophical reflections as independent region, Hegel affirms in absolute knowledge the legitimacy of this level of thought. The entire phenomenology of spirit can be interpreted as the phenomenology of philosophical consciousness, the description of this march towards integral knowledge, if at least one could admit the interpretation of absolute knowledge that we have attempted. This interpretation must not envelop Hegel's system from the outside like a destiny. History is for him not a passion in which he would lose himself, without there being any hope of being reconciled with the world, and without the death of God being redeemed daily by the pain of men. It The truth of the system is rather to be found in the history of what in him was the least historical. That is to say, in the type of reflection which, beyond history, allowed him to found philosophy as a system of history.